Hey, great to see you.
Great to
I
see
have
you too. Thanks for having me.
I have to tell my audience it's always great to see my son and see how accomplished he is and what an impressive bookshelf he has there in the background. But let me start by saying I wanted to talk to you, and we will talk about the Rolling Stone Top 100. But two current events came to my attention in the last couple of hours, and I'd be interested, as someone who's deputy music editor of Rolling Stone, what you're thinking about these. You've probably heard about at least one of them, maybe both of them. The most recent is it was an outrageous press conference or whatever it was between Vladimir Zelenskyy and Trump, in which Trump practically threw him out of the room. And they were screaming and yelling at each other. I've never in my life seen anything like that. And to me, it's another textbook case of the fascism that is gripping this country, that Trump, just about everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. And if you don't agree with the lie, then he's screaming and yelling at you, and you're the one who's crazy. And in the case now of the United States, his vice president, who's even worse than him, is right there in the room, and we have the whole Republican Party. So I know that you're in the music section of Rolling Stone as deputy editor, but Rolling Stone does have a political beat. And given what's happened with like Jeff Bezos and what he's done to the Washington Post, and the New York Times is not anywhere nearly as bad as that. They haven't been the greatest either. I'm just wondering what your view is as someone who's so important at Rolling Stone. What do you think the magazine is going to do in response to these kinds of things, which are only going to be getting worse?
Well, like you said, I work on our music coverage at Rolling Stone, but I think you raise a very good point. I mean, I'm proud to work at a publication that isn't afraid to stand up to the bullies and totalitarians who are in charge of the US government right now. My colleagues on our politics desk are doing incredibly brave, thoughtful work. They're not flinching from this moment. We're living in many ways unprecedented times. I think, like you said, we saw just today, the day that we're doing this interview, we saw, the president of the United States openly taking the side of a right-wing authoritarian imperialist adventurer. That would have been unthinkable not that long ago, but that's the world that we're living in. And I think this is a moment that really demands fearless, honest, bold coverage, not just in our politics desk, which I'm proud to work alongside, those colleagues, but even, really in people who are covering any form of culture right now. This is a really extreme, unprecedented moment, and I think we all have to look at it closely and look at it honestly, and I'm proud to work with people who do.
Well, I'm glad you're saying that. I think these are tough times, to say the least, that are ahead of us. And what's going on, obviously, is some of our most prominent media, as I said, are basically falling in line with what's going on. And so I think the country needs every bit of help that Rolling Stone can give it. Let me just switch to something else, which is completely different. It's closer to music, although in a way it has to do with politics too. And I don't know if you saw this, but Francis Ford Coppola, one of our favorite directors, you and I have been talking about him for like 20 years.
Mhm.
He was awarded a couple of Razzie awards, that idiotic thing, for like the worst director or whatever. And of course, it's true that the worst publicity is no publicity. And this actually will probably stir up some more interest in his movie. But you and I have talked about this before, about these critics and how on the one hand, they serve an important purpose, but on the other hand, they can do a lot of damage. So, first of all, what's your response as a Francis Ford Coppola devotee to this? And what do you think the best response would have been to what Francis Ford Coppola responded to?
Well, I loved his response to that. I mean, the Razzies are obviously they're sort of tongue in cheek. It's kind of a joke when they give out awards for like the worst film, the worst director, the worst actor. And, you could be offended by that. You could get mad about it. I thought he kind of took it in stride and he used it as an opportunity to point out that, yeah, that's right. He does take creative risks. He does make movies that maybe, a big studio wouldn't bankroll. He famously paid for his most recent movie himself with the money he had earned, from other pursuits. Um, he's someone who's always followed his own artistic vision, and it's given the world some really incredible movies. I think we need more people like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, to me, he's still the greatest director. I mean, there are a couple of people who come close to him, but what he managed to accomplish in the Godfather trilogy, I think no one has quite equaled that. I haven't seen Megalopolis. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet either. No.
Yeah, I don't think it's streaming anywhere, but sooner or later it has to be, right?
Right. Well, I know that was the film where there were reports that at some of the early screenings of that film at film festivals, there was a part of the movie where like an actor actually comes out in the theater and starts talking to the screen. I don't know if they've worked out a technology that will allow an actor to like show up in your living room and start talking to your screen, but maybe they're working on that now.
That's a good idea, though. Actually, they probably could have some kind of holographic thing that would come through the screen and you see the actor there.
If anyone can pull that off, I would trust Coppola. It might take another 20, 30 years to, raise the funds to follow that through.
Yeah, I was really impressed. I didn't know he's a great grandfather. Did you know that?
Yeah, it's a very accomplished family. Yeah.
That's right. All right, let's get now to the reason why I wanted to interview you. I've always been fascinated by lists, the best of, and in many ways they're one of the backbones of our popular culture. People pay a lot of attention to them. It's true that people just, put together lists and it's just really their opinions. It's not sales, which are an objective thing, or the number of times that there were, covers done of your, in this case, music, which is also objective. So tell us a little bit about how Rolling Stone has come to become one of the leaders in these musical lists. And then, in particular, what moved you at Rolling Stone, to do this list of the top 100 best protest songs?
Yeah, well, so lists are just one part of the many things that we do at Rolling Stone, but they are an important part. I think that we've found over the years that lists can be a way to really look at all kinds of things, put things together, see threads that connect things across time, across artists, across genre and place in really interesting ways. And so we've done all kinds of lists, about all kinds of music. The list that you're talking about, our list of the greatest protest songs of all time, I think the idea for that started to come together last year. I think we realized even then that we were reaching a point when protest music was kind of necessary, was something that people would turn to. And what we found when we were putting together that list and working on it was people throughout time, throughout history, have used music as a way of speaking out against the things that are wrong in the world, speaking out against injustice. And, that can happen in all kinds of different settings, all kinds of different causes, but music is always a great way of kind of getting the point across to a lot of people. And so I think, we ended up publishing that list early this year, right around the inauguration. I think we're living in a moment now when many people are outraged, are feeling that kind of shock and horror at what's going on. And I think we're living in a moment when protest music is more relevant than ever.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Do you think that people nowadays, people much younger even than you, are listening to protest music? I mean, I'll admit I'm almost totally ignorant as to like what new music is coming out these days.
It's a great question. I mean, there are great protest artists now. I think that from one perspective, you could say that there was a kind of golden age of protest music in the 1960s and 70s when youth culture, as you yourself remember, youth culture was kind of in the driver's seat of culture at large. That was a really unique cultural moment. That's not exactly how things are now, but there are tons of great artists making great protest music. Some of them are on that list that we published. Others who we want to kind of follow their career and see someday they might appear on there. I think of young bands like there's this punk band from the UK called Lambrini Girls. They make really awesome, fierce punk music that's speaking out against, xenophobia and racism and sexism and transphobia and so on. I think of there's another band called Echo Astral from Washington, D.C. area that's also making this just essential punk music that anyone who's feeling kind of dispirited by what's happening in the world now, listen to their records and you might feel a little bit more inspired.
Listen, I don't know if I ever told you this, but here's like a true family story. That mom and I first really got together. I mean, we knew each other, we were sort of friends. I invited mom to join me when we were having a meeting, the New Outlook, the folk rock group that I was in. And, we had sung a couple of protest songs, from the 60s, but we were actually beginning to veer into even, it was basically a guitar and three vocals doing our version of the Four Tops, I'll Be There, things like that. We, by the way, got booed at a club that we went to and we started singing that. But anyway, uh, we didn't plan on doing this, but like a big discussion broke out as to what we were going to start doing more and less of. And I was saying, and this was right in, like 1968, we're still fighting the Vietnam War. And I was like in the forefront of saying, we need to do more socially relevant stuff. And the other people, the other two people in the New Outlook didn't quite agree with me. And so we didn't stalk out of there, but mom and I eventually left. It was a very unpleasant meeting. And mom and I had like a good 2, 3 hour discussion about why it was so important that people sing these kinds of protest songs. So it is interesting, isn't it, that after all these years, I mean, I can't do the arithmetic, was it 50 years since the 1960s? 60 years, actually. My God, I mean, time's flying, that it's relevant again. Let's get to some of the songs that you included in there and some of the songs that you didn't include in there. And I know you, is not just you personally, it was a group of people at Rolling Stone. First of all, do you know what my favorite protest song of all time is?
Your favorite protest song of all time? No, why don't you tell me?
Well, it is a Dylan song.
Uh-huh.
It's not Masters of War, which I think is a very, very important song, but it's his other song. My name, it means nothing. My age, it means less. I mean, there's such a powerful song with God on our side, and the way it just builds up and builds up and builds up. And then, the very last, two lines, if God is on our side, he'd stop the next war. So my question is, why was that not at least included in the list?
It's a fair question. You're putting me on the hot seat here. No, but it's a totally fair question. I mean, I think something we did consider when we were making this list, when you're making a list of protest music and you get to considering Bob Dylan's contributions, Dylan was only really a protest singer for about 1 year. It was a relatively short period. As if you watch the movie A Complete Unknown, you see it wasn't. He didn't start as a protest singer and he abandoned it pretty quickly. But during that 1 year or so, that was really his main thing that he was doing, picking up a newspaper, seeing what was happening, and writing just some sort of incredibly perceptive, impassioned song about it. He was so good at that, and he wrote dozens of songs, in that time period that could make a list like this. There are so many. I think that the songs that we included on there. We included Masters of War, we included The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, and of course we had to include Blowin' in the Wind. Those are three kind of unimpeachable Dylan protest songs where he's taking on, really crucial issues. But you're right. I mean, with God on Our Side is an incredible one too. I think, as you say, he was one of the most kind of eloquent and expressive voices of the anti-war movement in song. Even though he didn't follow that through for, that long after that, when he was doing that, he was so good at kind of nailing the moral stakes of, the foreign wars that the United States was getting involved with at the time. And, I think that it goes to show you that, like you say, now more than 60 years after that song was written, it's still kind of you listen to that kind of indictment he has there of kind of the society that kind of mindlessly sacrifices, people to war, and it still hits home.
Yeah, it hits home more than ever. And, this actually, unfortunately, has relevance to the press conference between Trump and Zelenskyy, where basically Trump is rewarding this naked aggression, against Ukraine by Russia that everybody saw with their own eyes, and the world hasn't really progressed that much at all. Let's talk about Phil Ochs and tell your audience why uh, you and Rolling Stone in general decided to put a Phil Ochs song on its list. And the reason why I'm asking that question is I think most people who have been into folk music know there's like an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, if you know Phil Ochs's work, I mean, you and I have even talked about this at times. I mean, some of Phil Ochs's best songs are right up there with Dylan's best songs. But on the other hand, he's barely mentioned. And Dave Brown, your colleague at Rolling Stone, I interviewed him about his excellent book, Talking Greenwich Village, and we talked about Phil Ochs because there's a lot in that book about Phil Ochs. And one of the points that I actually didn't know that I learned from Dave's book is that Ochs, when he was beginning to go through some of the mental issues that eventually brought him down, there was a time when, like, he showed up at one of the village venues when Dylan was like putting together his Rolling Thunder band, and he was pretty abusive to Bob Dylan. So I mean, he everyone who's had an important impact has like a dark, dangerous side to their lives. It's just a question of how well it's disguised, how much it disrupts their public career. I think for Phil Ochs, that is one of the things that helped push him out of the limelight to the extent that he ever was in the limelight. His whole craziness about John Train, and he really was struggling with his very being for the last year or two of his life. So I'm glad that Rolling Stone included something by Ochs. Why don't you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, so we actually included two songs by Oaks on that list. We included "I Ain't Marching Anymore," which is, his classic anti-war song that became kind of an anthem, of resistance to just, mindlessly going along with the military draft. Great song. We also included Love Me, I'm a Liberal, a different kind of Phil Ochs song where he kind of really pointedly takes aim at the hypocrisy of the liberal establishment from the left. That's a song that kind of, hit some sore points when it was released. And I think even now you listen to it now and, it's a song that kind of still packs the same punch. Now, I obviously was raised from a young age by you and mom being taught about Phil Ochs' music. When I was growing up, Phil Ochs was as major a figure as, Bob Dylan or the Beatles, because you guys were big Phil Ochs fans. And so you played those records all the time, around the house when I was growing up, and you told me his story. And I remember I was kind of surprised when I grew up and left the house, when I realized that Ochs wasn't viewed as that kind of legendary figure. Many people don't even necessarily know who he is, out there in the wider world. And these days, when I meet someone who does have that knowledge and appreciation of Phil Ochs' music, like my colleague David Brown, it's always like kind of recognizing someone like, oh yeah, you know this too. Because if you do listen to Ochs' music, he was so great. I think he absolutely was comparable to, people like Dylan. He was one of the absolute all-time great protest songwriters. He's up there with, with Woody Guthrie, with Billy Bragg, with anyone like that. As you were saying, Oakes, so on the one hand, he was a complex, person. He had kind of personal mental health issues that tragically took his life by the end, but he also, one of the reasons I think that his career may be stalled out in some ways is what you're talking about. His politics were uncompromising. And, that's why if you look at those two songs, he went from in the earlier 60s saying, hey, the war is wrong, I'm not going to enlist. That's kind of, controversial in its way, but a kind of a clean, direct message. To a few years later, he's pointing at the kind of the Hubert Humphrey wing of the Democratic Party and saying, hey, you're a hypocrite here. You're not standing for what you really say you're standing for. And I think that rubs some people the wrong way, that kind of unsparing moral indictment. But I think that that's something, when you look back at it now, he was ahead of his time. You can listen to the ways that he was kind of skewering the establishment, even including the liberal establishment in the late 1960s, and he saw it clearly.
I agree. I cheered when Humphrey was chosen. Yeah, I mean, God,
And I find, for me, the last verse of that song of "Love Me Have a Rebel," where he says, he concludes by saying, "Now I've grown older and wiser, and that's why I'm turning you in." To me, whenever I hear that song, I try to kind of keep that with me as an example of what not to do. I try to make sure I'm never turning into the narrator from the end of that song who wants to turn in my former comrades because I'm so much older and wiser.
No, I know. Well, that's very good advice. And a lot of people fall prey to that. I mean, so this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I mean, I have been a big supporter of Jeff Bezos and Amazon in general because, and this is still true, just the invention of the Kindle liberated authors uh, from the tyranny of the gatekeeper. And I always think about who knows how many great works just never saw the light of day because they couldn't get an editor or an editorial board to pass on them. And that's one of the reasons why I always quote from Thomas Gray's poem Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark, unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Many a flower was born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. So this was written hundreds of years ago, but Thomas Gray got it. All these things that were, kept out of public view, and therefore no one ever knew about them. Every once in a blue moon, something is discovered. But I think that Amazon, in a variety of ways, liberated that part of the creative world, which had been kept out of public view, because look, editors don't always have the best judgment, and therefore it's especially upsetting that now, and in addition to that, as far as Bezos is concerned, he's the one who was already the owner of the Washington Post when he said democracy dies in darkness, and I guess that doesn't matter to him anymore. And so there, Phil Ochs was alive. If he was still alive today, he would probably either change up those lyrics, put a new verse in about Bezos, or who knows what he would do. So it is really a tough thing. I don't know if I ever talked to you about this. You may know about this uh, as far as Phil Ochs is concerned. That shortly after Phil Ochs took his life, Josh Meyerowitz, my colleague who I became friends with because we were both in the PhD program at NYU, and this was right around that time. It was shortly after Mom and I were married, and got married, and we actually did a radio show at WFDU-FM. That's Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I love telling this story because it's like one of the elements in my own life that I tend to celebrate because it shows how devious I am for a good cause. So, first of all, Josh and I decide to get together. I've been doing some kind of like once a month seminar on the air that I came up with for that radio station, college radio station. So shortly after Ochs died, Josh and I were talking, and I said, "Hey, why don't we do a special on Phil Ochs? We'll play some of his music." And Josh said, "Great." So we go down to the studio, and what we thought would be an hour turned into 3 hours of playing his songs and talking about them. So I get a call like a couple of days later from the uh, program director saying, "Hey, I was listening to your, the piece that you and Josh Meyerowitz did, the show you did on Phillips, but we can't possibly fit in 3 hours. We just don't have the time on that to do that." So I said, "Well, what's the most you can give us?" So he said, "Well, 2 hours is the absolute most. To Saturday night, we have a lot of other competing shows." So this is what I stooped to doing. I said to the program director, "Okay." And then I knew somebody at the New York Times who actually his job was to like, it was an interesting job to actually put together the radio listings. In those days, the New York Times listed everything that was on broadcast television and major radio shows. And WFDU was on the show. They had listed Seminar on the air from time to time. And of course, this is before email. So I send him a letter telling him about the special show, and which was supposed to now be slotted from 9 to 11. But my hand, quote, slipped, unquote, when I wrote the letter, and I somehow wrote 9 to 12 midnight. And so, sure enough, later that week, the Times comes out and it's listed from 9 to 12. So I call up the program director said, "Yeah, I don't know what happened. The Times made a mistake, but what are we going to do?" So he said, "Well, what can we do? We'll look like the ones who are idiots if the Times is publishing it. What's the matter with them?" So that's how we got the whole 3 hour thing broadcast. But if anyone is interested in listening to this, and I think it's worth listening to, and no one has heard it since it was done. Josh Meyerowitz told me last year that he found an old recording of that, and he's going to get me the recording. I'm going to digitize it so you can see what two people who love Phil Ochs had to say about him, shortly after, his death. Well, but getting back to what you chose for the Rolling Stone list, I agree with you. I think "Love Me, I'm a Liberal" is really a unique protest song. First of all, because it protests the other side. Not that songs that decry the war are in any way in too great a supply, because if anything, we need more of those. So good for Oaks, good for Dylan, good for everyone who's ever written an anti-war song. Obviously, it's not having as much effect as we would like, but we have to keep trying. But I do agree that "Love Me, I'm a Liberal" is an absolutely brilliant masterpiece for precisely the reasons you were talking about. Let's talk about Sam Cooke. So, as you know, I'm a Sam Cooke fan. I even wrote a crazy story about that, about three of Sam Cooke's songs. But tell us why you chose to put that song by Sam Cooke not only in the top 100, but so high up there.
Well, that song "A Change Is Gonna Come" by Sam Cooke, it's in some ways it's like a perfect recording. It's a brilliant song. Sam Cooke wrote it actually. He told people that he wrote that after hearing Dylan's song "Blowin' in the Wind" and saying, "I want to write a song that's that kind of simple and eloquent and speaks to the kind of what's happening in the country right now." And, it was the peak of the civil rights movement. People were fighting nonviolently against racism and being struck down. It was a really emotionally fraught time. And Sam Cooke was such a gifted singer and songwriter, but really it's his voice that was able to put so much subtle, nuanced emotion into those words. When he says, "It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is going to come." That's a song where he was able to, with his voice, encompass all of the kind of tragedy and sorrow of that decade. It's all in there, all of the assassinations and all of the violence, but also give people that note of hope and optimism that keeps people kind of holding on. And that song, of course, there's the added element that only a few months after he recorded that incredible song, Sam Cooke himself died tragically young, and so he didn't get to see the kind of the better world that he was imagining or dreaming of on that song, and that kind of gives the song an extra bittersweet tinge. But what it really comes down to with that song is that now, again, like 60 years after he recorded it, you can hear that song and it feels like he's singing about today's world just as much as he was singing about the world that he lived in the 1960s. It's still a world where people suffer, where people are living in an unfair racist world, and we still need that kind of note of hope and optimism that as dark as things get, that someday a change is going to come. Sam Cooke was able to speak to that so well and so clearly that decades later the song is just as powerful.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And yeah, if you think about it, Sam Cooke is the reverse trajectory of Dylan and even Phil Ochs, who went from protest into doing more pop songs. I mean, Phil Ochs actually did, go into pop, and actually one of the things that really hurt him, just again on Phil Ochs, is he was having a pretty good run with a small circle of friends, which is both protest and pop, but there are other pop songs that he put in there, and the brilliant radio stations took it off the air because the FCC had just said that they didn't want any radio stations to play songs that glorified drugs. And stations were afraid because there's a line in Small Circle of Friends, "Smoking marijuana is," and so, but that was actually a critique of smoking marijuana. But again, the stations weren't too intelligent. But by the way, this, not to go too far astray on this, I'll get back to Sam Cooke. This is one of the few things that I sometimes agree with MAGA Republicans about, but not with Trump, who has been threatening for a while to use the FCC to basically go after stations like MSNBC and so forth. And as you know, because you've heard me talk about this a lot, I think the FCC is flat out unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. Basically, it's a form of press, it's a form of speech. Radio is, so is television, and we don't need any government agency regulating it. So I wouldn't mind if Elon Musk dropped by the FCC and say, "Hey, you guys are out of business." That would be an example of a broken clock being right twice a day. Uh, but to get back to Sam Cooke, so first of all, he reverses the trajectory that both Dylan and Ochs go through. He starts out as a popular artist, but then the very last thing he does pretty much is this wonderful song. The other thing about Sam Cooke is Phil Ochs had a beautiful voice. Even Dylan, when he was in his prime, had a good voice. But no one holds a candle, right, to Sam Cooke's voice. It doesn't matter what he sings. It says, "Don't know much about history." I mean, it's a ridiculous little song, but it sounds great because of the way he sings it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think that's actually really relevant to what makes A Change Is Gonna Come such a great song. So, like you're saying, Sam Cooke, he started out, singing in the church. That's the tradition he came out of. He turned his talents towards making this kind of, poppy soul music. And he was so good at that, both the songwriting element and, as you say, his just incredible kind of like divine voice. When you think about him singing, like, Cupid, draw back your bow, or it's another Saturday night and I ain't got nobody, right? Those are great songs. His voice is just like, so smooth and such a deft instrument. And his songwriting on those songs, he was able to say so much with just a few kind of key lines. And the reason those songs became hits was because they were pop songs, but they had a little bit of cleverness and wit to them. And he was able to bring all of that, both the songwriting and that incredible voice, to write about a really serious subject on A Change Is Going to Come. And it shows that, all of that practice that he had writing these kind of songs that you can't get out of your head, he turned that to the protest medium, and it produced something amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I this is something else I've been talking my head off about. Not that it does much good, but it's just another one of the myriad examples of the insanity of this country, the United States. The number of guns that people have, it is just insane. And the rest of the world thinks we're insane, and they're right. And unfortunately, it's probably gotten worse. There are probably more guns in people's hands today in 2025 than there were when that woman, for whatever crazy reason was in her head, shot and killed Sam Cooke. So, this is something that, when you've been thinking about this for a very, very long time and nothing has really changed, if anything, it's gotten worse, it gives you pause to realize how difficult it is to improve things in society. Let's round out this discussion, and you don't have to reveal anything that you were like personally disappointed in, but well, maybe you can if you want. The problem with any list, right? It's a top 100 list. And anytime you make a list of anything, there are two issues. Did I rank them properly? And did I include everything that should have been in the list? So let me ask you both those questions. Now what? It's been like a little over like almost 2 months, I guess, since the list has been published. And obviously, I'm sure it was being created before then. So do you have like any thoughts about if you were putting out the list today, you might have rearranged something, A, and B, do you have any thoughts about, maybe something else should have been in the list?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously with a list like this, one of the limitations of the list format, is that you're restricted by the number. It's a hard limit. If you're going to do 100 songs, there's only 100 spaces, and if you want to add something, you have to cut something, and then that leads to hard choices. So I remember when we were making this list, I think I remember advocating for putting a second Phil Ochs song on there. I think we originally only had one, and I was like, this is someone who, when you're thinking about protest music, Ochs needs two songs to really show how important he was to that, to that lineage of protest music. I mean, I can imagine, adding more than two songs. You could say maybe he should have three songs the way that Dylan does. Maybe we should have, Here's to the State of Mississippi. That's another great, Oak song, but okay. Um, you know, I think the list turned out really well. I'm very proud of it. I think we really touched on a lot of different, times and places and causes and singers and genres. Um, I will say one thing that I realized looking back, afterwards, I wish we had done made a little bit more room for some of those like newer artists who I'm talking about. Maybe who, the counter argument is these are artists who they're still beginning their careers. They haven't accomplished everything they're going to accomplish. And, maybe in 10 or 20 years, we'll be more able to tell, which protest songs from 2024 or 2025 have really, stood the test of time. But, I think if I was working on the list again now, I would probably maybe argue a little bit more to include a couple more newer songs, maybe.
Yeah, I saw someone and heard someone. It wasn't the greatest, it was okay. Somebody on YouTube, like maybe like 2016, 17, tried to come up and sang, and I guess he had a guitar he was strumming, updates of Phil Ochs's. Some of Phil Ochs's songs. So, Here's to the State of Mississippi. Phil Ochs himself updated it to Here's to the State of Richard Nixon.
Right.
Spiro Agnew, da, 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 something, Spiro Agnew is the something of the land. I mean, it's a great, great lyric. And actually, so this was probably in 2017, because it doesn't scan as well, but already there exists a Here's to the State of Donald Trump. So you can obviously sing a song like that, and of course when somebody is taken from us way too soon, although so many years have gone by, who knows if Phil Ochs would be alive now, and I guess even the same is true with John Lennon. But when you find yourself in times like these, you can't help but wonder what they would be singing and saying now, and you can't help but yearning for an answer. But I think you actually provided the answer. It's the newer artists who come and sing. But it takes a lot to break in, break out. It's not the same as it was, even in the 50s and 60s. Let's conclude by talking a tiny bit about Trupa Trupa. This is Grigos Kwiatkowski's group, although he often wants to emphasize he's like an equal member in the group. And he's going to be in New York City tomorrow. And for those of you who are interested in it, today is February 28th. Tomorrow is March 1st. So first of all, I've listened to some of Trupa Trupa's songs. They do some kind of protest songs, right?
I would say so for sure. I mean, this is something I've written about with them. Trupa Trupa, they're a great band coming from Poland. The music that they make, if you're listening to it kind of casually, you might hear what's on the surface, which is kind of this, kind of dark, moody guitar music and shouted vocals and things like that. And the lyrics that Gregor writes tend to be, kind of abstract and poetic because he's a poet. But when you listen more closely, and particularly if you listen to, what he says, how he talks about his songs, almost every one of the songs that they play has this common message about standing up against authoritarianism, standing up for freedom and democracy, standing up against fascism. That's something that, that's not a kind of subject that people have to imagine, in the part of the world that Trupa Trupa is from. Poland knows all too well what it's like to have a totalitarian force, occupying your country, both in, the past and in the recent past. And, I think that as we're now dealing with, kind of an authoritarian government of our own in the United States, fitting into this kind of trajectory of authoritarian governments all around the world, we're now just one of the many. I think listening to music from bands like Trupa Trupa can kind of show us the way forward in a lot of ways. That's a band that when you listen to their music, they're kind of lighting the torch, holding up the torch for freedom, holding up the torch for humanity in the face of these regimes that kind of seek to deny our humanity and that seek to crush difference and to, force conformity. Trupa Trupa says, no, we have to stand up against that. We have to be proud of being individuals and being, all kinds of different kinds of people instead of going along with a kind of authoritarian impulse. And I think that's a really valuable thing to hear.
No, I agree with you completely. And Grigor is obviously is not only a poet and part of this band, he's actually done research into the Holocaust, the remains of some of the victims, and so on. And, I often think, there was a time when I would be certainly more concerned about him going back to Poland than staying here in the United States. But given what's going on here in the United States, we unfortunately are headed in that direction. And meanwhile, Poland, although it's way too close to Russia, another fascist state with a lunatic in charge, so in that sense, it's in much more jeopardy than anything here. But isn't it disquieting to sort of realize that in some ways, when Grigors and Trupa Trupa go back to Poland, they'll be living in a freer society than what's quickly happening here in the United States.
Right. They're going to back home to a country where I think, the democratic tradition is under less direct threat right now than it is here, which is kind of a shocking thing to realize.
Yeah, whoever thought that we'd ever be in this situation? I often say if I were to write like a science fiction story, something that takes place in the future, some kind of like apocalyptic story, if I had written that like 10 years ago and made it like it is now, that is it is actually the case now. Getting back to editors, no editor that I know of any science fiction magazine would have accepted it for publication because it's too far fetched. Even though it's science fiction, it has to have some connection to reality. So the place where Trupa Trupa will be performing tomorrow night in New York City, May 1st at 9 p.m. is what, the Bowery? What's the name of it?
Bowery Electric, yeah.
Bowery Electric. All right. Well, you may get a glimpse of yours truly at Simon, and who knows, what else. So be nice to us if you come by. Listen, this was great talking to you. Today's like a day for our family. Mom went to Sarah's
Yeah.
event this morning at Scarsdale. So slowly but surely, we're taking over the world.
Yeah, great. This has been a great conversation. Glad to be here.
You take care then.
All right, Pops, love you.
Love you
Bye.
too, my boy. Bye bye.